Section 32 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place Names the Place, Part 13. Monsieur de Charlus having gone, Robert and I were free at last to dine with Bloch. Yet I realized during this little party that the stories too readily admitted by our friend as funny were favorite stories of Monsieur Bloch senior, and that the son's really remarkable person was always one of his father's friends whom he had so classified. There are a certain number of people whom we admire in our boyhood: a father with better brains than the rest of the family, a teacher who acquires credit in our eyes from the philosophy he reveals to us, a schoolfellow more advanced than we are, which was what Bloch had been to me, who despises the Musée of the Espoir en Dieu when we still admire it, and when we have reached Leconte or Claudel, will be in ecstasies only over Assemblée à la Zuecca. Vous étiez bien assez, with which he will include Padoue est un fort bel endroit, au de toi, grande lecture endroit, mas jamais mieux la polenta, passée dans mon domino noir, la tourbatelle. And of all the Nuits, will remember only Au Havre, devant l'Atlantique, à Venise, à la Frau Lido, au vient sur l'herbe d'un tombeau, mourir la palais Adriatique. So whenever we confidently admire anyone, we collect from him, we quote with admiration sayings vastly inferior to the sort which, left to our own judgment, we would sternly reject, just as the writer of a novel puts into it, on the pretext that they are true, things which people have actually said, which in the living context are like a dead weight, form the dull part of a work. Saint-Simon's portraits composed by himself, and very likely without his admiring them himself, are admirable, whereas what he cites as the charming wit of his clever friends is frankly dull where it has not become meaningless. He would have scorned to invent what he reports as so pointed or so colored when said by Madame Cornwell or Louis XIV, a point which is to be remarked also in many other writers. It is capable of various interpretations, of which it is enough to note but one for the present, namely, that in the state of mind in which we observe, we are a long way below the level to which we rise when we create. There was then embedded in my friend Bloch a father Bloch who lagged 40 years behind his son, told impossible stories, and laughed as loudly at them from the heart of my friend as did the separate, visible, and authentic father Bloch, since to the laugh which the latter emitted, not without several times repeating the last word so that his public might taste the full flavor of the story, was added the braying laugh with which the son never failed, at table, to greet his father's anecdotes. Thus it came about that after saying the most intelligent things, young Bloch, to indicate the portion that he had inherited from his family, would tell us for the 30th time some of the gems which Father Bloch brought out only, with his swallowtail coat, on the solemn occasions on which young Bloch brought someone to the house on whom it was worth while making an impression. One of his masters, a chum who had taken all the prizes, or, this evening, Saint-Loup and myself. For instance, a military critic of great insight who had brilliantly worked out, supporting them with proofs, the reasons for which, in the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese must inevitably be beaten and the Russians victorious, or else he is an eminent gentleman who passes for a grand financier in political circles, and for a great politician among financiers. These stories were interchangeable with one about Baron de Rothschild and one about Sir Rufus Israels, who were brought into the conversation in an equivocal manner which might let it be supposed that Monsieur Bloch knew them personally. I was myself taken in, and from the way in which Monsieur Bloch spoke of Bergot, I assumed that he too was an old friend. But with him, as with all famous people, Monsieur Bloch knew them only without actually knowing them, from having seen them at a distance in the theatre or in the street. He imagined, moreover, that his appearance, his name, his personality were not unknown to them, and that when they caught sight of him they had often to repress a stealthy inclination to bow. People in society, because they know men of talent, original characters, and have them to dine in their houses, do not on that account understand them any better. But when one has lived to some extent in society, the silliness of its inhabitants makes one too anxious to live, suppose too high a standard of intelligence in the obscure circles in which people know only without actually knowing. I was to discover this when I introduced the topic of Bergot. Monsieur Bloch was not the only one who was a social success at home. My friend was even more so with his sisters, whom he continually questioned in a hectoring tone, burying his face in his plate, all of which made them laugh until they cried. They had adopted their brother's language, and spoke it fluently, as if it had been obligatory and the only form of speech that people of intelligence might use. When we arrived, the eldest sister said to one of the younger ones, "Go, tell our sage father and our venerable mother." "Puppies," said Bloch, "I present to you the Cavalier Saint-Loup, hurler of javelins, who is come for a few days from the Doncières to the dwellings of polished stone, fruitful in horses." And since he was as vulgar as he was literary, his speech ended as a rule in some pleasantry of a less Homeric kind. "See, draw closer your pepla with fair clasps. What is all that I see? Does your mother know you're out?" And the Misses Bloch subsided in a tempest of laughter. I told their brother how much pleasure he had given me by recommending me to read Bergot, whose books I had loved. Monsieur Bloch senior, who knew Bergot only by sight, and Bergot's life only from what was common gossip, had a manner quite as indirect of making the acquaintance of his books, by the help of criticisms that were apparently literary. He lived in the world of very nearlies, where people salute the empty air and arrive at wrong judgments. Inexactitude, incompetence do not modify their assurance. Quite the contrary. It is the propitious miracle of self-esteem that since few of us are in a position to enjoy the society of distinguished people, or to form intellectual friendships, those to whom they are denied still believe themselves to be the best endowed of men, because the optic of our social perspective make every grade of society seem the best to him who occupies it, and beholds it as less favored than himself, less fortunate, and therefore to be pitied, the greater man whom he names and calumniates without knowing, judges and despises without understanding them. Even in cases where the multiplication of his modest personal advantages by his self-esteem would not suffice to assure a man the dose of happiness, superior to that accorded to others, which is essential to him, envy is always there to make up the balance. It is true that if envy finds expression in scornful phrases, we must translate, "I have no wish to know him," by, "I have no means of knowing him." That is the intellectual sense. But the emotional sense is indeed, "I have no wish to know him." The speaker knows that it is not true, but he does not, all the same, say it to simply deceive. He says it because it is what he feels, and that is sufficient to bridge the gulf between them, that is to say, to make him happy. Self-centeredness thus enabling every human being to see the universe spread out in a descending scale beneath himself who is its lord, Monsieur Bloch afforded himself the luxury of being pitiless when in the morning, as he drank his chocolate, seeing Bergot's signature at the foot of an article in the newspaper which he had scarcely opened, he disdainfully granted the writer an audience, soon cut short, pronounced sentence upon him, and gave himself the comforting pleasure of repeating after every mouthful of the scalding brew, "That fellow Bergot has become unreadable. My word, what a bore the creature can be! I really must stop my subscription. How involved it all is, bread and butter nonsense." And he helped himself to another slice. This illusory importance of Monsieur Bloch senior did, moreover, extend some little way beyond the radius of his own perceptions. In the first place, his children regarded him as a superior person. Children have always a tendency either to depreciate or to exalt their parents, and to a good son his father is always the best of fathers, quite apart from any objective reason there may be for admiring him. Now, such reasons were not altogether lacking in the case of Monsieur Bloch, who was an educated man, shrewd, affectionate towards his family. In his most intimate circle they were all the more proud of him because if, in society, people are judged by a standard, which is incidentally absurd, and according to false but fixed rules, by comparison with the aggregate of all the other fashionable people, in the subdivisions of middle-class life, on the other hand, the dinners, the family parties all turn upon certain people who are pronounced good company, amusing, and who in society would not survive a second evening. Moreover, in such an environment where the artificial values of the aristocracy do not exist, their place is taken by distinctions even more stupid. Thus it was that in his family circle, and even among the remotest branches of the tree, an alleged similarity in his way of wearing his moustache and in the bridge of his nose led to Monsieur Bloch's being called the Duc de Maul's double. In the world of club pages, the one who wears his cap on one side and his jacket tightly buttoned, so as to give himself the appearance, he imagines, of a foreign officer, is he not also a personage of a sort to his comrades? The resemblance was the faintest, but you would have said that it conferred a title. When he was mentioned, it would always be Bloch. Which one? The Duc de Maul? As people say, Princess Murat? Which one? The Queen of Naples? And there were certain other minute marks which combined to give him, in the eyes of the cousinhood, an acknowledged claim to distinction. Not going the length of having a carriage of his own, Monsieur Bloch used on special occasions to hire an open victoria with a pair of horses from the company, and would drive through the Bois de Boulogne, his body sprawling limply from side to side, 2 fingers pressed to his brow, other 2 supporting his chin, and if people who did not know him concluded that he was an old nuisance, they were all convinced, in the family, that for smartness Uncle Solomon could have taught Gramont Caderousse a thing or two. He was one of those people who, when they die, because for years they have shared a table in a restaurant on the boulevard with its news editor, are described as well-known Paris figures in the social column of the Radical. Monsieur Bloch told Saint-Loup and me that Bergot knew so well why he, Monsieur Bloch, always cut him that as soon as he caught sight of him, at the theatre or in the club, he avoided his eye. Saint-Loup blushed, for it had occurred to him that this club could not be the jockey of which his father had been the chairman. On the other hand, it must be a fairly exclusive club, for Monsieur Bloch had said that Bergot would never have got into it if he had come up now. So it was not without the fear that he might be underrating his adversary that Saint-Loup asked whether the club in question were the Rue Royale, which was considered lowering by his own family, and to which he knew that certain Israelites had been admitted. No, replied Monsieur Bloch, in a tone at once careless, proud, and ashamed. It is a small club, but far more pleasant than a big one, the Ganaches. We're very strict there, don't you know? Isn't Sir Rufus Israels the chairman? Bloch Jr. asked his father, so as to give him the opportunity for a glorious lie, never suspecting that the financier had not the same eminence in Saint-Loup's eyes as in his. The fact of the matter was that the Ganaches Club boasted not Sir Rufus Israels, but one of his staff. But as this man was on the best of terms with his employer, he had at his disposal a stock of the financier's cards, and would give one to Monsieur Bloch whenever he wished to travel on a line of which Sir Rufus was a director, the result of which was that old Bloch would say, "I'm just going round to the club to ask Sir Rufus for a line to the company." And the card enabled him to dazzle the guards on the trains. The Misses Bloch were more interested in Bergot, and, reverting to him rather than pursue the subject of the Ganaches, the youngest asked her brother, in the most serious tone imaginable, for she believed that there existed in the world, for the designation of men of talent, no other terms than those which he was in the habit of using. Is he really an amazing good egg, this Bergot? Is he in the category of the great lads, good eggs like Villiers and Catullus? I've met him several times at dress rehearsals, said Monsieur Nassim Bernard. He is an uncouth creature, a sort of Schlemmel. There was nothing very serious in this allusion to Chamisso's story, but the epithet Schlemmel formed part of that dialect, half German, half Jewish, the use of which delighted Monsieur Bloch in the family circle, but struck him as vulgar and out of place before strangers. And so he cast a reproving glance at his uncle. "He has talent," said Bloch. "Ah!" His sister sighed gravely, as though to imply that in that case there was some excuse for me. "All writers have talent," said Monsieur Bloch scornfully. "In fact, it appears," went on his son, raising his fork and screwing up his eyes with an air of impish irony, "that he is going to put up for the Academy." "Go on. He hasn't enough to show them," replied his father, who seemed not to have for the Academy the same contempt as his son and daughters. "He's not big enough. Besides, the Academy is a salon, and Bergot has no polish," declared the uncle, whose heiress Madame Bloch was. A mild and inoffensive person whose surname, Bernard, might perhaps by itself have quickened my grandfather's powers of a diagnosis, but would have appeared too little in harmony with a face which looked as if it had been brought back from Darius's place and restored by Madame de la Floye, had not, chosen by some collector desirous of giving a crowning touch of Orientalism to this figure from Susa, his first name, Nassim, stretched out above it the pinions of an androcephalous bull from Khorsabad. But Monsieur Bloch never stopped insulting his uncle, whether it was that he was excited by the unresisting good humor of his butt, or that the rent of the villa being paid by Monsieur Nassim Bernard, the beneficiary wished to show that he kept his independence, and more important still, that he was not seeking by flattery to make sure of the rich inheritance to come. What most hurt the old man was being treated so rudely in front of the manservant. He murmured an unintelligible sentence of which all that could be made out was, "when the Mescors are in the room." Mescors, in the Bible, means the servant of God. In the family circle, the Blochs used the word when they referred to their own servants, and were always exhilarated by it, because their certainty of not being understood either by Christians or by the servants themselves enhanced in Monsieur Nassim Bernard and Monsieur Bloch their twofold distinction of being masters and, at the same time, Jews. But this latter source of satisfaction became a source of displeasure when there was company. At such times Monsieur Bloch, hearing his uncle say Mescors, felt that he was making his Oriental side too prominent, just as a light of love, who has invited some of her sisters to meet her respectable friends, is annoyed if they allude to their profession or use words that do not sound quite nice. Therefore, so far from his uncle's request producing any effort on Monsieur Bloch, he, beside himself with rage, could contain himself no longer. He let no opportunity pass of scarifying his wretched uncle. "Of course, when there is a chance of saying anything stupid, one can be certain that you won't miss it. You would be the first to lick his boots if he were in the room," shouted Monsieur Bloch, while Monsieur Nassim Bernard, in sorrow, lowered over his plate the ringleted beard of King Sargon. My friend, when he began to grow his beard, which was also blue-black and crimped, became very like his great-uncle. "What? Are you the son of the Marquis de Marsan? Why, I knew him very well," said Monsieur Nassim Bernard to Saint Loup. I suppose that he meant the word knew in the sense in which Bloch's father had said that he knew Bergot, namely, by sight. But he went on, "Your father was one of my best friends." Meanwhile Bloch had turned very red. His father was looking intensely cross. The Misses Bloch were choking with suppressed laughter. The fact was that in Monsieur Nassim Bernard the love of ostentation, which in Monsieur Bloch and his children was held in check, had engendered the habit of perpetual lying. For instance, if he was staying in an hotel, Monsieur Nassim Bernard, as Monsieur Bloch equally might have done, would have his newspapers brought to him always by his valet in the dining-room in the middle of luncheon, when everybody was there, so that they should see that he travelled with a valet. But to the people with whom he had made friends in the hotel, the uncle used to say what the nephew would never have said, that he was a senator. He might know quite well that they would sooner or later discover that the title was usurped. He could not, at the critical moment, resist the temptation to assume it. Monsieur Bloch suffered acutely from his uncle's lies and from all the embarrassments that they led to. "Don't pay any attention to him. He talks a great deal of nonsense," he whispered to Saint Loup, whose interest was all the more whetted, for he was curious to explore the psychology of liars. A greater liar even than the Ithacan Odysseus, albeit Athene called him the greatest liar among mortals. His son completed the indictment. "Well, upon my word," cried Monsieur Nassim Bernard, "if I'd only known that I was going to sit down to dinner with my old friend's son! Why, I have a photograph still of your father at home in Paris, and any number of letters from him. He used always to call me uncle, nobody ever knew why. He was a charming man, sparkling. I remember so well a dinner I gave at Nice. There were Sardou, Labiche, Augier, Molière, Racine, Corneille," Monsieur Bloch added with sarcasm, while his son completed the tale of guests with Plautus, Menander, Kalidasa. Monsieur Nassim Bernard, cut to the quick, stopped short in his reminiscence, and aesthetically depriving himself of a great pleasure, remained silent until the end of dinner. "Sans loup with the helm of bronze," said Bloch. "Have a piece more of this duck with thighs heavy with fat, over which the illustrious sacrificer of birds has spilled numerous libations of red wine." As a rule, after bringing out from his store for the entertainment of a distinguished guest his anecdotes of Sir Rufus Israels and others, Monsieur Bloch, feeling that he had succeeded in touching and melting his son's heart, would withdraw, so as not to spoil his effect in the eyes of the big pot. If, however, there was an absolutely compelling reason, as for instance on the night when his son won his fellowship, Monsieur Bloch would add to the usual string of anecdotes the following ironical reflection, which he ordinarily reserved for his own personal friends, so that young Bloch was extremely proud to see it produced for his. "The government have acted unpardonably. They have forgotten to consult Monsieur Coquelin. Monsieur Coquelin has let it be known that he is displeased." Monsieur Bloch prided himself on being a reactionary, with a contempt for theatrical people. But the Misses Bloch and their brother reddened to the tips of their ears, so much impressed were they when Bloch senior, to show that he could be regal to the last in his entertainment of his son's two chums, gave the order for champagne to be served, and announced casually that as a treat for us he had taken 3 straws for the performance which a company from the Opéra Comique was giving that evening at the casino. He was sorry that he had not been able to get a box. They had all been taken. However, he had often been in the boxes, and really one saw and heard better down by the orchestra. All very well, only if the defect of his son, that is to say, the defect which his son believed to be invisible to other people, was coarseness, the father's was avarice. And so it was in a decanter that we were served with, under the name of champagne, a light sparkling wine, while under that of orchestra stalls he had taken 3 in the pit, which cost half as much, miraculously persuaded by the divine intervention of his defect that neither at table nor in the theatre, where the boxes were all empty, would the defect be noticed. When Monsieur Bloch had let us moisten our lips in the flat glasses which his son dignified with the style and title of craters with deeply hollowed flanks, he made us admire a picture to which he was so much attached that he had brought it with him to Balbec. He told us that it was a Rubens. Sans Loup asked innocently if it was signed. Monsieur Bloch replied, blushing, that he had had the signature cut off to make it fit the frame, but that it made no difference, as he had no intention of selling the picture. Then he hurriedly bade us good night, in order to bury himself in the Journal Officiel, back numbers of which littered the house, and which, he informed us, he was obliged to read carefully on account of his parliamentary position, as to the precise nature of which, however, he gave us no enlightenment. "I shall take a muffler," said Bloch, "for Zephyrus and Boreas are disputing to which of them shall belong the fish-teeming sea, and should we but tarry a little after the show is over, we shall not be home before the first flush of Eos the rosy-fingered. By the way," he asked Sans Loup when we were outside, and I trembled, for I realized at once that it was of Monsieur de Charlus that Bloch was speaking in that tone of irony, "who is that excellent old card dressed in black that I saw you walking with the day before yesterday on the beach?" "That was my uncle." Sans Loup was ruffled. Unfortunately, a floater was far from seeming to Bloch a thing to be avoided. He shook with laughter. "Heartiest congratulations. I ought to have guessed. He has an excellent style, the most priceless dial of an old gaga of the highest lineage." "You are absolutely mistaken. He is an extremely clever man," retorted Saint Loup, now furious. "I am sorry about that. It makes him less complete. All the same, I should like very much to know him, for I flatter myself I could write some highly adequate pieces about old buffers like that. Just to see him go by, he's killing. But I should leave out of the account the caricaturable side, which really is hardly worthy of an artist enamored of the plastic beauty of phrases, of his mug, which, you'll forgive me, doubled me up for a moment with joyous laughter, and I should bring into prominence the aristocratic side of your uncle, who, after all, has a distinct bovine effect, and when one has finished laughing, does impress one by his great air of style. But," he went on, addressing myself this time, "there is also a matter of a very different order about which I have been meaning to question you, and every time we are together, some god, blessed denizen of Olympus, makes me completely forget to ask for a piece of information which might before now have been and is sure some day to be of the greatest use to me. Tell me, who was the lovely lady I saw you with in the Jardin d'Acclimatation, accompanied by a gentleman whom I seem to know by sight, and a little girl with long hair?" It had been quite plain to me at the time that Madame Swann did not remember Bloch's name, since she had spoken of him by another, and had described my friend as being on the staff of some ministry, as to which I had never since then thought of finding out whether he had joined it. But how came it to Bloch, who, according to what she then told me, had got himself introduced to her, was ignorant of her name? I was so much surprised that I stopped for a moment before answering. "Whoever she is," he went on, "hearty congratulations. You can't have been bored with her. I picked her up a few days before that on the Zone Railway, where, speaking of zones, she was so kind as to undo hers for the benefit of your humble servant. I have never had such a time in my life, and we were just going to make arrangements to meet again when somebody she knew had the bad taste to get in at the last station but one." My continued silence did not appear to please Bloch. "I was hoping," he said, "thanks to you, to learn her address, so as to go there several times a week to taste in her arms the delights of Eros, dear to the gods. But I do not insist, since you seem pledged to discretion with respect to a professional who gave herself to me 3 times running, and in the most refined manner, between Paris and the Pont de Jour. I am bound to see her again some night." I called upon Bloch after this dinner. He returned my call, but I was out, and he was seen asking for me by Francois, who, as it happened, albeit he had visited us at Combray, had never set eyes on him until then. So that she only knew that one of the gentlemen, who were friends of mine, had looked in to see me. She did not know with what object, dressed in a nondescript way, which had not made any particular impression upon her. Now, though I knew quite well that certain of Francois's social ideas must forever remain impenetrable by me, ideas based, perhaps, partly upon confusions between words, between names which she had once and for all time mistaken for one another, I could not restrain myself, who had long since abandoned the quest for enlightenment in such cases, from seeking, and seeking moreover in vain, to discover what could be the immense significance that the name Bloch had for Francois. For no sooner had I mentioned to her that the young man whom she had seen was Monsieur Bloch, than she recoiled several paces, so great were her stupor and her disappointment. "What! Is that Monsieur Bloch?" she cried, thunderstruck, as if so portentous a personage ought to have been endowed with an appearance which made you know, as soon as you saw him, that you were in the presence of one of the great ones of the earth. And like someone who has discovered that an historical character is not up to the level of his reputation, she repeated in an impressed tone, in which I could detect latent, for future growth, the seeds of a universal skepticism, "What! Is that Monsieur Bloch? Well, really, you would never think it, to look at him." She seemed also to bear me a grudge, as if I had always overdone the praise of Bloch to her. At the same time she was kind enough to add, "Well, he may be Monsieur Bloch and all that. I'm sure master can say he's every bit as good." She had presently, with respect to Saint Loup, whom she worshipped, a disillusionment of a different kind and of less severity. She discovered that he was a Republican. Now, for all that, when speaking, for instance, of the Queen of Portugal, She would say, with that disrespect which is among the people the supreme form of respect, Amélie, Philippe's sister. François was a royalist, but when it came to a marquis who had dazzled her at first sight, and who was for the Republic, seemed no longer real. And she showed the same ill humor as if I had given her a box which she had believed to be made of gold, and had thanked me for it effusively, and then a jeweler had revealed to her that it was only plated. She at once withdrew her esteem from Saint Loup, but soon afterwards restored it to him, having reflected that he could not, being the Marquis de Saint Loup, be a republican, that he was just pretending, in his own interest, for with such a government as we had it might be a great advantage to him. From that moment her coldness towards him, her resentment toward myself, ceased, and when she spoke of Saint Loup, she said, "He is a hypocrite," with a broad and friendly smile, which made it clear she considered him again just as much as when she first knew him, and that she had forgiven him. End of section 32.